Hello and what is up YouTube? My name is G3Iron and welcome to today's discussion where we are featuring 3 different wonderful, beautiful explosive arrow guides and doing a quick comparison and overview of different approaches to this particular build style and play style in Path of Exile. Thank you so much to everybody who left kind words on our last build guide comparison featuring Poison SRS. Thanks so much for everybody who left both encouragements as well as feedbacks and critiques for us to continue to improve and learn on as we try and shape and form and host these sorts of discussions. Today we're featuring 3 wonderfully well put together and incredibly detailed build guides on explosive arrow. Now, each of these particular guides has got both video descriptions or forum guides or written guides with extensive notes included in the POBs, and all of the various resources that you're going to need to be able to follow along these builds should you choose to play any of these archetypes will be linked down below in the video description, along with the resources that we're going to be mentioning and referencing. Without any further ado, let's introduce the 3 various builds that we're going to be taking a look at, dissecting, and comparing during today's discussion. Today we will be comparing Super Secret Tech's Explosive Arrow Champion, Palsteron's Explosive Arrow Elementalist, and Zizaran's Explosive Arrow Juggernaut. Something to keep in mind throughout our discussion today is that each of these build guide creators have specified what sort of league and what sort of experience their build is intended for in Path of Exile. So if you go in with, let's say, a hardcore solo self-found ruthless mindset into one of these build guides, well, you will be sorely disappointed that the build guide is not specifically tailored for your style of playing Path of Exile. So be aware, Zizaran generally plays hardcore, Palsteron and Super Secret Tech generally are recommending their builds for a more softcore environment. There are some tips and tricks that each of the build guide creators share in each of their videos about whether farming particular divination cards or using different beast crafting recipes in order to acquire certain levels of gear. So there's recommendations for you to be able to play this in either solo self-found or in a trade league environment. But again, take that with a caveat, because depending on your own level of experience of play in Path of Exile, you will either need to spend serious time crafting or serious time trading or serious time grinding in order to make the ultimate endgame versions of these builds. Each of the build guide creators have made sure to mention a couple of tips that are very helpful for anybody who's looking into playing Explosive Arrow. First off, Super Secret Tech recommends farming your bow, your 6-link short bow, using the Porcupine Divination card. There's a couple of different maps and a couple of different zones that it can pop up in. He's got notes about where to farm and how to acquire those particular divination cards if you're playing SSF or if you're playing trade. Then what you're going to want to do is turning in your Porcupine card, having your 6-link short bow, you'll craft +2 to bows by slamming essences on that bow. I greatly appreciated this as a tip because it allows players to potentially farm for themselves their own 6-link, or to be able to know exactly what they're looking for by potentially crafting or potentially trading for their desired endgame weapon. Next up, Palsteron gives us some recommendations about some things to avoid that can actually unintentionally brick our damage. He recommends that we avoid using additional various mechanics onto projectiles such as pierce or let's say fork or let's say chain, because the way how Explosive Arrow works, the fuse is only going to attach to the last enemy that it actually makes contact with. So if you're using something like, let's say, pierce, and you've got an arrow that goes through an enemy, well, there's going to be no damage actually dealt to that enemy. Palsteron has got so many of these little tips and tricks. He's even got a dedicated video just to answering frequently asked questions about playing Explosive Arrow. So lots of tips in there if you've got any questions about how to play the build or how to play Explosive Arrow in general and what sort of mistakes you might make along the way that could unintentionally be harming your damage by huge percentages. The third tip today comes from Zizaran, and Zizaran, of course, recommends taking Unwavering Stance in order to make sure that you become stun immune as a character, meaning that you can remain mobile throughout whatever encounter, whatever map, whatever boss it is that you are currently engaging with, and by staying mobile, you're also able to keep your totems up and placed in key positional spots to be maximizing the damage that your totems and thereby explosive arrows will be doing. A lot of players see Juggernaut as the Ascendancy and assume that the particular build is going to be acquiring the immunity to stuns through Ascendancy, but because of the way how Ziz has built his tree, he's right next to Unwavering Stance anyway, and so because of this, along with scaling iron reflexes, he doesn't care about evading attacks. Therefore, this is a wonderful little trick to make sure that you're stun immune, free for defensive purposes and repositioning, and also free to keep placing totems and keep taking down whatever content you're taking on. The last tip from all of these build guide creators is about elemental equilibrium. This is an age-old thing in Path of Exile, but I feel like I would be doing everyone a disservice if I did not at least mention this. If you have sources of added flat damage in your explosive arrow build, when you've also got elemental equilibrium on, you will destroy, you will wreck your own damage. You will be buffing enemies accidentally by having those sources of flat added fire damage to enemies that you're attacking or that you're dealing damage towards. So just please be aware, make sure, double check. I've seen it with all of these build guide creators. They always go back whenever anybody's got a question about, hey, my damage is bricked or my damage feels low, what's going on? This is one of the first check marks that the build guide creators go through and say, hey, do you make sure that you don't have any sources of flat added damage? Because if you do, you might be bricking your elemental equilibrium and unintentionally buffing the resistances of the monsters you're trying to kill. One thing that I'm trying to do in today's comparison is trying to relatively normalize the configurations of each of these path of buildings that have been put out by each of these build guide creators. Now, I've got a slight ethical issue here that I just wanted to let you be aware of. So those of you who are dropping comments and going, hey, why haven't you normalized all of the calculations across the board? Well, because these aren't my POBs to mess with in that regard. What I'm doing here today is comparing POBs and comparing these guides and giving you the numbers based off of the build guide creators and what they've got checked and the configurations that they have set up for displaying and for essentially walking you through if you choose to play this style of build. So I think it'd be a little weird. I don't know about any of you, but I just would feel a little bit weird if I start going in and messing with a lot of the configurations. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to let you know some of the configurations that each of these POBs has, which then might allow you to either simulate, replicate, or mess around with the POB with however your fancy is inclined when you are preparing to play one of these builds. So here are some of the differences. Super Secret Tech has got Life Tap plus Fortified plus Enemy Covered in Ash and plus Enemy Ignited set as all ticks in the configuration panel of his POB. Palsteron has Life Tap, Onslaught, Convergence, and Enemy Ignited, and then Zizaran has Life Tap, Enemy Ignited, and Enemy Burning. Those are the configurations for all of these players. What I have done to normalize and make sure that all of the players are fighting essentially against the same hypothetical enemy is to normalize the boss enemy that all of them are supposedly fighting against in the POB configurations. So if you were worried about one of these particular POBs looking like it's got damage going against Merveil in Act 1 and another one going against the Shaper, don't worry about that. We've tried to normalize that today. Let's take a look at some defensive numbers for each of these particular builds. The effective health pool, the Juggernaut comes in with the highest health pool, which maybe should come as no surprise, but the size of the effective health pool on this particular Juggernaut is insane. His total effective health pool for Zizaran's Jug is 156,000. That's the EHP on this thing. He can take a 19,000 Fizz hit, 63,000 Fire, 66,000 Cold and Lightning, and a 39,000 Chaos Max hit before his character goes down. By comparison, Palsteron's Elementalist has got an 83,000 effective life pool, with Fizz taking 20,000, Elementals taking 49,000, and Chaos taking 12,000. Super Secret Tech's Champion has an effective health pool of 45,000, being able to tank a Fizz max hit of 11,000, Elemental max hit of 31,000, and Chaos max hit of 5,000. One of the biggest single difference makers in the size of the effective health pool of each of these players is the Chaos resistance. You can see that on Super Secret Tech's Champion, he's got negative 18% Chaos resistance. For the Elementalist, negative 22%, whereas for Ziz's EA Juggernaut, he's got 78% Chaos resistance, and that makes a huge difference for surviving a Chaos hit. Another layer of defenses that both the Champion and the Elementalist can boast about, that the Juggernaut does not boast at all, is having high spell suppression chance. Super Secret Tech's Champion has got a 99% chance to spell suppress, while Palsteron's Elementalist has got a 100% chance to spell suppress. One of the things that's really great about doing these comparisons, something that I've learned as I've been looking and comparing at Path of Buildings over the last several years, is that while a life pool might seem similar to another player's life pool, it doesn't actually mean that they're quite the same. You can see this very clearly in the effective hit pools of each of these characters. They've all got 4,500 or above flat life, but you can tell the difference in between the maximum size of a hit that they can take, or even multiple hits coming from specific sources, which will, in some cases, lead to a character death, and in other cases, be relatively small through all the layers of mitigation that are available and provided through the build that has been put together by the creator. This really exposes and shows off a lot of the game mechanics and a lot of the complexities of making a build in Path of Exile be tanky. You can't simply just look at your various life levels and assume that you're tanky. You can no longer do what we used to do almost 10 years ago when many of us started playing Path of Exile and simply go, hey, are my resistances capped and do I have a sizable health pool? There are multiple layers of defenses nowadays that you need to check off or tick or account for if you want your character to be able to survive in multiple instances of diverse content. Now, what the Juggernaut offers in terms of damage mitigation, it doesn't offer in terms of speed, and it's worth noting that both Super Secret Techs and Palstyron's Elementalist are both displayed here without using Quicksilver move flasks. With just a couple of passive points put into move speed, you can see that the champion has got 52 movement speed, and then the Elementalist has got 89% movement speed. That is a zoom playstyle that is simply not available when you go as tanky as the Juggernaut option. Enough about the BG's favorite subject of staying alive. Let's turn our attention over to dealing damage. Super Secret Tech's champion deals a whopping 5 million full DPS. Palstyron's Elementalist comes in with 14 million DPS, taking the top spot, and Ziz's Juggernaut comes in the middle of those with 6 million DPS. With 20 fuses set, there's a little bit of a disclaimer here. A lot of the time, against many different bosses in Path of Exile, you will not be able to reach a full stack of maximum 20 full fuses set. So there are different circumstances like your totems being dead, or you're simply moving around too much so your totems aren't up, or there's a phase going on, and as the boss comes out of the phase, maybe you've got all your totems ready to go, maybe you don't. Totem placement is definitely a skill that you can see as you're watching different players or as you're observing other different players or watching videos. It's definitely an aspect to the explosive arrow playstyle of placing your totems in such a spot that they will stay alive and be able to maximize their damage. That being said, these are still totems that are firing off your explosive arrow, and so it still allows for a set it and forget it sort of playstyle and approach, but I just want to make it clear to folks that you can maximize your damage with your skill as a player in placing your totem. So sometimes your damage might feel low, not because of your gear, not because of your passive, but actually genuinely because of your own player skill and the build that you're interacting with. So take that for what it's worth. If you're a player that just wants the set it and forget it sort of playstyle, you could play Explosive Arrow and have a great time with it. If you're a player that really wants to min-max and strategize and get really in-depth into your micro and placement of your totems in order to maximize your damage, you can do that with this playstyle as well. Another thing to remember about the Explosive Arrow playstyle is that Explosive Arrow takes a moment to actually deal its damage. And so if it feels like your damage is a bit delayed, as though the damage is sometimes going on while you're moving through a pack or potentially even behind you, that has to do, again, with your totem placement and your own movement and your own playstyle as a player. If you're having to backtrack a lot, then maybe ask yourself about where you're placing your totems in relationship to the player, to you and to your character, and in relationship to your goals, where you're moving next in a map or in a zone. It's worth stating that while Palstyron's Elementalist has got significantly more damage than either Ziz's Jug or Super Secret Tech's Champion, all three of these builds have got plenty of damage to be able to take in high endgame content in Path of Exile, at least as we know it right now in the 320 Forbidden Sanctum League. All three of these builds provide plenty of damage to take on whatever boss you'd like to take on in PoE, granted with enough player skill and with enough player knowledge of the fight and the encounter that you're engaging. Now, how do we get to those full DPS numbers? Well, I'd like to make a couple of observations here. You will notice that the attack damage off of Explosive Arrow is actually one of the components of Explosive Arrow that is not going to be dealing the most amount of damage. The biggest part of your damage on explosive arrow is going to be your ignite DPS. Now, the total damage of your ignite is going to matter based off of your ignite duration as well as the burning speed of your ignite. So while some of these builds look a bit more impressive with their hit rate, you'll notice that actually the thing that gets you the higher top end damage is not having a higher hit rate or having a higher hit when you actually make an impact with your fuse, but it's actually the explosion, the detonation of the ignite that is going to be burning and ticking down and ultimately taking down, again, whatever monsters it is that are stupid and silly enough and having a bad enough day to be on the receiving end of your totem's wrath. Attack speed is a big deal for this build, and you will notice that all three of the build guide creators mention and discuss hitting certain thresholds for their attack speed. There are thresholds to reach in order for you to have X number of totems down and to be able to reach your maximum potential damage. And so that is going to be something for you to pay attention towards later on when we're talking about the various items and particularly endgame weapons that you're going to be using for explosive arrow, because it is absolutely essential for you to get top end DPS, for you to have top end, at least at certain thresholds and at certain breakpoints, attack speed. One point of comparison here is just to take a look at Super Secret Tech and his hit rate, his hit chance on the path of building tree that we had set up for this comparison was that his hit chance was only at 68%, and you want that to be at 100% for you to be able to reach your top end numbers. And so what I did in order to normalize all of the numbers was I went in, made sure that the couple of extra passives that he had allowed for players to use in his POB were then allocated in towards accuracy. And so with this next number that we're able to pull up, you can see with a hit chance of 91% instead of 68% that his damage goes up quite significantly. His average damage goes up by more than 256k for a total combined damage of over 10 million. Yes, hit chance matters even when you're playing explosive arrow. So each of these builds are different in different ways, but what do they all have in common? Well, first off, what they all have in common is +3 bows. And we mentioned this a moment ago about the damage and the attack rate and the thresholds that you want to hit for your attack speed on these various explosive arrow builds. The thing that all three players recommend are that you get +1 to level of socketed gems on your bows, and then also have +2 to level of socketed bow gems. Now, both Super Secret Tech and Palsteron have a natural roll on their bows of 19% increased attack speed, whereas Izoran's Juggernaut has got 13% increased attack speed crafted, which is lower, and it's low enough that he's hoping, at least as he communicated in his build guide video, to get a natural roll, which would allow him to hit some better damage numbers for that threshold of attack speed that you're looking to reach. For those of you who are wondering why some of these bows are going to include minion rolls on them, if you're anything like me and you're going, wait a second, why would you put minion damage on these bows? Just a brief reminder for those of you who are out there who might be confused, totems are not minions, okay? So don't think that this has anything to do with totems being counted as minions. They do not. What this has to do with is taking the various notable passive for Spiritual Command, which make increases to minion attack and cast speed also apply to you. So this means that these modifiers that apply to monster attack and cast speed actually apply to you as a player. The next thing that all three build guide creators recommend and all have in common is in the belt slot, using the unique belt, the Dyadian Dawn. By the way, how do you guys pronounce this? Do you pronounce it Dyadian Dawn or Dyadian? Anyway, drop me a comment down below with how you pronounce this. Me and my silly Midwestern US accent is probably butchering this. You'll notice at the helpful price comparison chart provided by PoE Ninja that this is not a very expensive belt. This is a belt that is relatively common, relatively cheap, and early on in a league is pretty available. Within 10 days of launching of the 320 Forbidden Sanctum League, Dyadian Dawn went down from over 100 chaos in its initial price on League launch day, down to around 20C within 10 days of League launch. So you might be saying, Iron, what on earth could make this belt so dang important for an explosive arrow build? I mean, aren't there plenty of other builds out there that take advantage of Headhunter and Mageblood? What is it about explosive arrow that makes Dyadian Dawn such a strong consideration for three different great builds to feature it? Well, the key line is right here above my slightly shiny and balding forehead. It reads, ignites you inflict with attacks, deal damage 35% faster. This one category alone can be the difference in millions of damage. Let's take a look at Palsteron's Elementalist. You know, the one that does over 14 mil DPS? Let's take a look at what his particular POB numbers look like when he's got a Dyadian Dawn equipped versus when he doesn't. With the Dyadian Dawn equipped, his ignite damage is ticking at a healthy 10.9 million DPS with an ignite duration of 3.85 seconds. Without the Dyadian Dawn equipped, his ignite DPS drops down to 8.2 million with an ignite duration of 5.32 seconds. In other words, the ignite duration gets longer, meaning it takes longer to do the 8.2 million damage that the ignite is going to do, and the ignite itself is actually less damage over that longer period of time. Ideally, we're doing more damage in a faster period of time, and this is what the Dyadian Dawn allows players to do. Super Secret Tech also includes in his notes to his POB guide that you can use catalysts in order to further improve this build and even further boost your damage by using catalysts on your Dyadian belt. So if you were wondering whether or not this belt was truly that important for all three of these builds, the answer is yes. Could you slot something else in? Yes, you could, but you'll be significantly slowing your overall damage and lowering your overall damage. All three of these build guides feature mostly overlapping options for their skill gem setup. A couple of them have got bossing setups as well as clear setups. I tried to compare the clear setups versus one another. So for Super Secret Tech's champion, you've got Explosive Arrow, Light Tap, Ballista Totem, Empower, Combustion, and Ignite Proliferation. For Palsteron's Elementalist, you've got Explosive Arrow, Life Tap, Ballista Totem, and Ignite Proliferation. That's where they stay the same. Where they differ is using elemental damage with attacks and deadly ailments instead of combustion. Zizaran recommends using Explosive Arrow, Life Tap, Ballista. All sounds pretty much standard across all three builds, but then he differs there by using Empower, Awakened Burning Damage, and Combustion. Now, I think there's a bit of an argument to be had here whether you go with deadly ailments versus combustion, and you can see the difference between Palsteron and Zizaran. At least the way how Zizaran seems to articulate it, it feels a lot better, especially if you're running maps that, let's say, you're in an SSF environment and you can't always recraft your maps or reroll your maps or trade your maps away. And let's say your maps roll something where monsters simply can't be ignited or avoid elemental ailments or have a percentage to. And Zizaran was able to say that he was able, through the use of combustion rather than deadly ailments, to still run these maps with some effect because of his hit damage being more effective and more reliable than his ignite damage. Obviously, in those settings, his ignite damage is overall pretty sick. So I'm going to leave that to those various build guide creators to actually argue the finer points of these two distinctions. It seems like there's a couple of varied options between running with Empower, running with Burning Damage, running with Deadly Ailments, or running with Combustion. But the hallmarks of all of these builds are Life Tap, Ballista Totem, Explosive Arrow, and then, if you want to clear things at least, using Ignite Proliferation. Enough about skill gems, let's chat about passive trees and ascendancies. So not all of these trees look alike. There are some similarities in where these trees are going to end up with. For instance, all of the trees are going to have several key notables that are going to be overlapping, but the way how each of these characters gets to those notables is something of a difference maker in the shape and the formation of their passive trees. For Super Secret Tech's champion, he's got Ancestral Bond, Elemental Overload, and Elemental Equilibrium. Now, all three builds are going to take advantage of those three keystones. This means that all of the builds have +1 to the maximum number of summoned totems that they've got. They've all got Elemental Overload, which means when they crit, they're going to be doing 40% more damage. And they've all got Elemental Equilibrium, which is going to lower the resistance, if you set things up correctly, of the monsters and the bosses that you are attacking and engaging with. So that way they are going to end up taking a larger chunk of explosive arrow fire damage. Besides for those three keystones, this is where things take a slight divergence. Palsteron, as a defensive mechanic, in order to cap out his spell suppression champs, takes Magebane. Now, his tree is set up in such a way that he's already traveling through and by many of the nodes that are near Magebane. He's got some dexterity to be able to make up the gap between his gear and the rest of his passive tree in order to cap out his spell suppression chance and take 50% less damage from spell hits. Zizaran, however, doesn't take Magebane because, of course, he's not going to have any spell suppression whatsoever. He's going to rely on other means of mitigating damage. Those other means are, first off, to use Iron Reflexes to convert all of his evasion into armor. This This is one of the reasons why he's got such ridiculous armor on the character. And then also to use the Timeless Jewel to be able to corrupt a keystone, so that way he's got Tempered by War. Zizaran's got a great little explanation in his Juggernaut overview about why he goes with Tempered by War as a notable keystone. And the big thing for you to take away from this, without getting into all the mathematic numbers, is that armor has got diminished returns the higher amounts of armor that you've got. But when you combine Tempered by War with splitting elemental damage, along with the Juggernaut's way of splitting elemental damage and making some of your armor apply to elemental hits, it essentially means that smaller elemental hits are mitigated by the chunks of armor that you've already got. If you don't want to get into the math of it, don't worry about it. If you do want to get into the math of it, then I encourage you to check out his video, as well as checking out the wiki entry on Tempered by War and the wiki entry on how armor is calculated and the diminished returns of it. Moving from the passive tree to ascendancies, let's take a look at how different player choices regarding Ascendancy lead to different outcomes for their build. The choice of champion as an Ascendancy allows for both damage and defenses. For Super Secret Tech, his build uses both the Forbidden Flame and Forbidden Flesh jewels to allow him to allocate essentially a 9th passive point onto his Ascendancy, giving him worthy foes. So if you're looking at these Ascendancy nodes and saying, hey, wait a minute, it looks like one player has chosen some extra notables there on the Ascendancy, that's where that's coming from. As a champion, defensively, you've got mitigation with armor and evasion while fortified, you've got stun immunity while fortified, you've got permanent fortify, you've got intimidation on enemies, and reduced damage taken from enemies who have been taunted. Statistically speaking, you can see the numbers showing up above my slightly balding forehead. If you take away the champion Ascendancy from Super Secret Tech's path of building and you leave all of the other configurations the same, the character loses about 9,000 effective life, which is quite a hit to the power of the character and quite a display of the champion as a strong Ascendancy choice for the Explosive Arrow archetype. For those who go the Elementalist route, the reason is most likely going to be because of damage and then again even more damage. Shaper of Flame gives around 21% combined damage according to POB. Heart of Destruction gives around 23% damage with Convergence, and then Mastermind of Discord gives you around another 16% of your damage. So, in other words, if you go into POB, you keep all the configurations and items and skill gems and passive tree all the same that Polsteron has set up, and you only remove the Ascendancy choices. Instead of dealing 14 million DPS on your full DPS with 20 fuses clicked, instead you'll be dealing 6 million DPS. Meaning that the Ascendancy alone, according to POB's calculations, for playing Elementalist as Explosive Arrow, is worth 8 million DPS. And that's huge. You can see why players who want to simply play Explosive Arrow with the zoomiest and the boomiest style of play go with the Elementalist. It's a ton of damage. Lastly, for Ascendancy choices is the Juggernaut, which what the Elementalist is to damage, the Juggernaut is to defenses. But the Juggernaut's not without its own offensive abilities, and for Zizaran's particular build, about 26% of his accuracy comes from the undeniable Juggernaut node, meaning that without the added bonus of accuracy and attack speed from the Juggernaut, the build loses about 600k DPS. We've already talked about Tempered by War, and now it's important to note that Tempered by War does indeed combo with Unbreakable to give all of that armor that you are stacking up on your body armor additional, essentially layers of defense, both to physical hits, but also to elemental hits that you are then absorbing. It's worth saying that the better your body armor is on a build that is using Unbreakable, the better Unbreakable is as a node. The worse your armor piece is on your character's body armor slot, the worse Unbreakable is as an investment as a Juggernaut player. For this configuration in Zizaran's POB, if you uncheck Unbreakable, that reduces the effective health pool by about 97,000. So more than half of the effective hit pool of this character is due to that one single Ascendancy node according to POB's calculations. All right, so we've looked at the character defenses, we've looked at the character offenses, we've looked at how to form these particular builds and what makes them distinct. Let's go ahead from here and make some recommendations about each of these 3 different wonderful, exceptional build guides. If you are starting off today wondering, hey, explosive arrow, it sounds cool, it looks fun, I think I'll give it a shot. If that's you today, but you've got no other prior experience with the build, and you're not really sure what sort of playstyle it feels like, and you're just wondering, I would like to try this out, maybe for the first time, then I would highly recommend you go with Super Secret Tech's build as a champion. It's going to give you some solid mechanisms, some solid layers for both offense and defensive categories, and it's going to give you a nice, well-rounded approach as well as a helpful leveling guide to your progression as you fill out and experience what Explosive Arrow as an archetype can feel like. So if you're just starting out with Explosive Arrow, this is where I would start you. If, however, you've got some experience with Explosive Arrow, or you've got a ton of currency that you want to sink into a trade league, you don't mind dying, but you do want to go zoom zoom and lots of boom boom, in that case, I recommend you check out Palstyron's Elementalist, which is going to give you the highest damage version out of these 3 particular build options. You want to zoom? You want to boom? Go Palstyron's Elementalist. Lastly, if you're playing in an environment where death is a severe allergic reaction to your soul, then I recommend you go with Zizran's Juggernaut. It is by far the tankiest, it can take the biggest hits, and he's also got some helpful, wonderful tips for you to be able to play this build either in a hardcore environment or in a solo self-found environment. Well, thanks so much for joining us today for today's discussion in comparing these 3 particular build guides and what they look like in POB and on paper, all the numbers, all the offense, all the defense, and of course, all of the tips and tricks to the archetype. I will say this particular build guide comparison took me a lot longer to put together than our previous one. It was a lot of checking of configurations and double checking numbers and finding errors that I was making and double checking and going back and refining and refreshing. So if this was a particular build guide comparison that you appreciated, I'd love to hear that down below in the comments. And of course, if you enjoyed it enough that you'd like to see more discussions like this, you can always give us a thumbs up as a like and a subscribe to the channel. That lets us know that you want more video discussions just like this one. I'd love to hear down below in the comments, of course, any mistakes that I've made. I'm sure that we've made plenty of mistakes today, so feel free to share whatever critiques, feedback, and suggestions for future discussions to help us continue to improve these discussions as we put them out. And I'd also love to know what stands out to you about each of these 3 particular approaches to the Explosive Arrow archetype. Each particular build guide creator has come up with their own unique approaches, their own unique answers, and their own unique challenges that they really want to focus on with their build guide. I'd love to know what makes each of these unique in your minds and which ones you would recommend to other players and what sorts of other players you would recommend each of these build guides to. Lastly today, I'd love to hear down below in the comments what build archetypes you'd like us to take a look at and do comparisons on in the future. Thanks once again for joining us, and I hope today is the day a Mirror of Calandra drops for you.
Thanks for watching that video. If you'd like more information on any of our discussion points today, you can see them down below in the video description. If you'd also like to join our Discord or support our Patreon, you can do so with the links down below. Thanks again, and big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters.